The show must go on. After Poland pulled out of the two-day Visegrad Nations Summit in Israel, set to kick off today, each country will now go it alone, with the entire conference canned in favour of bilateral meetings with the Israeli Prime Minister and the leaders of the remaining countries, the Czech Republic, Hungary and Slovakia. Israel's foreign ministry announcing the joint meeting will not take place, saying the conference requires all four countries to attend. The conference crumbling after an offhand comment by Israel's Premier Benjamin Netanyahu in Warsaw Thursday, telling reporters that, quote, Poles cooperated with the Nazis. The seemingly innocuous comment infuriating his Polish hosts, who reject suggestions that their country collaborated with Hitler. That led to the Polish leader saying that he would downgrade representation to the conference, sending the foreign minister instead. The nail in the coffin, though, when the newly appointed Foreign Minister of Israel made these comments on I24 News during our special 2019 elections coverage programme. This was on the first day on the job. Yisrael Katz throwing his support behind the Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister expressed himself. He made himself clear. I am the son of Holocaust survivors, and like every Israeli and Jew, we will not forget and we will not forgive. And there were many Poles who collaborated with the Nazis. That's what Yitzhak Shamir said. They murdered his father, the Poles. He said the Poles suckle anti-Semitism from their mother's breast. No one will tell us how to express ourselves and remember the fallen. And these statements are very clear, and none of us will compromise on them.
And joining me from Poland, journalist Malagosia Krakowska, and in studio with me, I24 News senior international affairs correspondent Owen Alterman. Owen, we'll start with you because, of course, you were there in Warsaw when Netanyahu made these comments. Talk us through what you make of how this actually unfolded.
Well, Tracy, this unfolded at the beginning, not after what Yisrael Katz said on our air last night, but at the beginning as a media issue, and that's very, very important to explain. What was happening? Again, we were at a briefing with the Prime Minister, about 20 or 25 of us, sitting with him in a circle, an on-the-record briefing, but a more intimate one. A question was asked about the Holocaust law. A follow-up question was then asked and said to the Prime Minister, but there is still civil liability for saying that Poles collaborated with the Nazis. And when I heard that, Tracy, this is an issue I know well. I covered it in Poland a year ago. I started whispering to the person next to me that that's not what the law actually says. The law does not say that you cannot say that Poles didn't collaborate with the Nazis. So the Prime Minister, after that question, he sort of looks down. It wasn't his favorite question of the briefing, albeit, of course, a completely legitimate one. And he says, sort of taking his hands out this way, goes, Poles collaborated with the Nazis. And I've never heard of anyone being sued under the law. I think the point the Prime Minister was trying to make was my point, in a sense, that the law does not forbid saying that. Again, saying that Poles, meaning individual Poles, collaborated with the Nazis. But what happened coming out of that briefing, Tracy, the reporters, we were not allowed to record the conversation. Some reporters reported the Prime Minister saying not Poles collaborated with the Nazis, but the Poles, meaning collectively, Poles as a nation, as a society. Obviously a very different message that goes to the heart of the controversy over the Holocaust law. That was amplified even more by one Israeli outlet using the word Polish nation. Then we were off to the races. But again, this seemed to be on a low burner. But then you just heard what Yisrael Katz, the currently serving Israeli foreign minister, had to say to us on I24 News. Certainly not a media issue, and that's taken this crisis to an entirely different dimension.
Absolutely, and now we know that, of course, the Polish leader had pulled out of the conference, and then, in light of Yisrael Katz's comments, then it was canned altogether. Malgosia, what do you make then of Poland's decision to pull out of the conference?
I think Poland's behavior during the last 3 days has puzzled me personally, because I seen from afar this is seen as a very immature reaction to the words spoken by Netanyahu. Because if you look back to the course of the history, and those are really painful accounts, testimonies in Polish history, there were collaborators. There were Polish collaborators who cooperated with Nazis, with Germany. In that time, almost 17,000 active collaborators set aside 7,000 people to save the Jews. I mean, it's a fact. And I don't think that they should get insulted by that. I think that Poland's reactions are impulsive, and it's as if they're acting out of injured pride. Hey, we're hosts, we're hosting you here, and you made these kind of comments. I think that pulling out is a mistake, and it shows that Poland has to work out on its ad hoc diplomacy in this case.
Okay, and what do you say to that?
Well, listen, first of all, it's fair to say, I got to defer to our guest. That's a minority opinion in Poland, and I do think after what Yisrael Katz said, again, that's hard to misinterpret. It's hard to misinterpret those comments. Again, that takes us to a different dimension. Going back to what Prime Minister Netanyahu said, Tracy, very, very important to emphasize, if this from the get-go had been reported in a more precise way about what exactly the Prime Minister said, the fact that he didn't use that Hebrew letter hey, he didn't use the word the, he just said Poles as individuals, I suspect the crisis would never have happened. I suspect the Polish government would have accepted that, maybe not have been thrilled by it, would have accepted that. This is consistent with the Polish government's position. We've heard this from Polish government representatives in the past. Everyone understands there were millions of people living in Poland during the World War II, and that some of them collaborated with the Nazis. Of course, there can be an argument about how many it was. But again, I think if this had been reported correctly, none of this would have happened. But again, it was reported incorrectly. That got the juices flowing. That got the emotions out. And at that point, the Polish government had to respond. And then the issue was out in the open, really making it only a matter of time until someone would make an inflammatory comment. Who knew it would be the Israeli foreign minister?
Right.
Who knew it would be in our channel?
Now, Malagosia, we know that this conference was important to Netanyahu, who is, of course, trying to build a bloc of support in the European Union against the EU's policies against Israel. So what now will it take to get Poland back on side?
I think that mutual dialogue is a very important thing. Talking about it, perhaps apologizing to each other for misinterpreting, for misreporting the words, talking. I think that mature leadership talks, first of all, and not pulls out when you have this kind of spat going on. Whether it will hurt Israel's stance in EU, that's another question. Israel has forged ties with Italy at the same time, with Hungary at the same time. One of the biggest players in Israel in the EU is Germany. Poland was always at the kind of peripheral. It's important for Israel to have more friends in Europe than foes, of course. So I think that getting back on the table, talking to each other, talking about mutual history, recognizing certain things, don't hold a grudge and act maturely, then the dialogue is open, everything is open back.
Certainly, wouldn't that be great, acting maturely? Owen, though, of course we know that Benjamin Netanyahu had high hopes for this conference. How disappointed would you say he is now?
Look, I think on the one hand he's disappointed, Tracy. This would have been the first time the Visegrad Group has ever held a summit outside the four countries. Obviously a great feather in Israel's cap and an important part of Benjamin Netanyahu's strategy of finding spoilers within the European Union, countries who are willing to vote with Israel against a pending EU consensus on some decisions that could potentially criticize Israel. That said, 3 of the 4 leaders are still on their way. They're still going to be here. They're still going to meet with the Prime Minister. He'll still be able to make Israel's case with them. Obviously, there will be a cloud hanging over this event because of Poland backing out and the Polish relationship very important. But I think the Prime Minister will be quite happy to have the other 3 here.